Thank you so much for joining me, Irina, to launch our first series of cross-culture encounters. For those of you who may not know you, could we start by hearing about your childhood and your early career? Where were you born and anything from that time on that's relevant to what you do now?
That is a good question. So I was born and raised in Western Siberia, Russia, which is on the border of the Ural Mountains, which divides Russia into the European part and the larger Asian part. So I was born on vacation, and I think I was always had the traveling bug. I come from a family of linguists, so I'm a third generation linguist. My grandfather spoke 7 languages. He was born and raised in China, for that matter, and then he moved back to the Soviet Union. My mother went to the same school that I graduated from, Tumen State University. So I always was fascinated by people and cultures and was very passionate about learning about other people, how they live, what they like, the customs. And then when the Soviet Union collapsed, I had an opportunity to become an exchange student and come to Ohio near Ashtabula. So I was one of the first students from Russia. And from that, I became a lifeguard in California in a YMCA camp. Then I got my master's degree in Monterey Institute of International Studies. And before I even graduated, I had an opportunity to join NASA in 1998 to become a simultaneous interpreter for the space station program, which is a great cooperation between 15 countries. So you have all kinds of people trying to work together peacefully on the ground to make progress for the humankind in space.
What an incredible opportunity. Last time we spoke, I remember you talked about a Russian company that had started doing business in the US. And you reminded me of some interesting statistics about how we listen and the problems we can have if we just focus on the words and the grammar. I believe that was in 2012.
I believe it was 2014, as I was working on a very interesting project. It was a pipe making project, and so we had all kinds of cultures as part of the team. We had a Chinese CFO, we had the Russian investors and technical specialists, we had the Mexican line workers, we had Indian quality control. And so there was a lot of miscommunication happening at that time. And as a professional interpreter, I was trying to find very effective ways of communicating. And I realized it's not just the words that matter. In fact, it's only 7% of our communication happens verbally. 93 happens with what is unseen or through gestures also what is unspoken, and sometimes what is not spoken is more important than what is being said.
And how are smiles perceived in Russia?
Well, in Russia, I would believe it's similar to Germany. In fact, when first McDonald's opened up, I believe it was 1992, it was on Pushkin Square. It was a Canadian franchise. They had to change the protocols for the Russian clients because that was the same thing. Russians would come in and they would look at smiling, greeting workers and they would back out because they were thinking, what are they smiling about? Am I not dressed correctly? Or do they have something to hide? There was a lot of mistrust immediately because for a Russian person in general, a neutral face is no smile. And then if you're friendly, if you're happy, then you share the smile. In the US, a neutral face is with a smile to show I have nothing to hide, I'm friendly. So therefore, it's important to account for that in protocols when business travel around the world and open their businesses to adjust their business language to that of the audience.
Yes, you can't expect to become culturally competent after just watching a video, hearing a speech, or even attending a workshop. It's a bit like sport. You need to keep exercising, you need repetition. You need to go and practice what you've learned and then come back to reflect and learn more.
I agree. And sometimes when people think about cross culture, they think about other countries. I remember I was speaking in North Carolina at one of the assemblies for RV park owners and campgrounds. And there was an older gentleman who had a campground, mom and pop campground. And he said, Irina, you're telling us about the Germans, the Vietnamese, the Arab countries. He said, why would I care in the woods of Tennessee? I'm not planning to go anywhere there. Why should I care? And I looked at him and I was thinking, he has a point. So I removed the triangle that you will show us in a few minutes with the countries. And I said, it's about communication. It's about people. It's about how we see the world, how we communicate. It's of the values, the conflict resolution. It's what motivates us. And that's what's important to remember when we talk about cross-culture. It's not about the cultural differences of different countries, but first of all, it's about people.
Yes, and there are many cases where companies have had huge problems through not handling the customers in the right way, not understanding the way they think and react. Walmart comes to mind. When they opened in Germany, they lost at least $1 billion. And basically, just because someone insisted that you should have greeters at the door smiling at you. And as I know that you know, most Germans mistrust any stranger who smiles at you.
Speaking about my previous project, I mentioned the pipe making company. I remember the team when I arrived, the turnover was over 70%. And so they were trying to improve communication in this multicultural team, which was excellent. But listening was a problem. Also speaking, it's not, if you work with the global team, if you work with the diverse team, it's not always acceptable for team members to speak up if they're not asked individually. So as I observed the first week of, I went to all different meetings, and what I observed was the same five guys, the American guys, loud and boisterous, would speak at every meeting, and the CEO will say, well, which measures of saving this million, we need to save $1 million this year on expenses, what suggestions you have? And they'll come with the same suggestions of maybe buying a different grade of toilet paper and changing for saving light bulbs and all of that. So those were good suggestions, but they were not bringing $1 million. And as I was observing different team members, I've noticed that CFO, who was of Chinese origin, was working the hardest. He was the first to open the office and the last to leave. So one time I stopped by his office and I said, what are you working on? And he brought a whole binder and he had different tabs. And he said, Irina, I'm working on the task that the CEO requested us to do to find $1 million in expenses. And I said, that's very interesting. I said, so which areas? And he had a whole system worked out from buying in bigger quantities the steel they needed for the pipes to finding different uniforms, different suppliers, and doing paying cash for this. So I said, how much savings do you have? He said, so far I have 1,200,000. And I said, why don't you speak up at the meetings every Friday? The CEO is asking. And he said, nobody asked me. So then I talked to the CEO and I said, have you noticed that you have the same five people at every meeting coming with similar suggestions every time? And I said, have you asked other members? And he said, being an American CEO, he said, well, I open the floor. I give an opportunity to everybody to speak. And if they don't speak, maybe they have nothing. And I said, look for the sparkling eyes in the audience. When people have sparkling eyes, it means they want to say something, but they don't. And they said, well, how do I ask them to say? I said, you create an opportunity. So as a modern leader, we need to create opportunities to include all the team members, and that's adjusting to their culture. So once he asked the CFO, then he was very happy, brought the binder and shared, and they implemented a lot of those saving measures and were very successful.
How great to hear that you're able to revert that situation. Your client must have been so happy. But it's not just the big corporations that can be affected by this, it also affects people.
Absolutely. And then even giving critique, I think is important as, let's say, if we have a US manager who is trying to give some feedback to employees, let's say in Europe somewhere, sometimes they tiptoe so much that instead of coming as a critique or feedback to improve, the employee might decide that that's a raise is coming up very soon because it was quoted in so much praise. So we have to adapt our language to the people who we're delivering it so they will understand it correctly, because so much misunderstanding can happen.
Oh, that's a very British problem. There are so many stories of people getting the wrong end of the stick just because we're so indirect. But you've run your own business with your husband. Did you ever encounter problems like this?
We had this small RV park with my husband. I mean, trying to make the sale over the phone was very important to adapt. And I'm all about sharing stories and telling about the beautiful sunsets and romantic dinners with your spouse and catching the first fish with your grandchildren. And then all of a sudden, we got a customer who was very specific. He said, Irina, what's the length of the connection and to my port of water, and what's the electricity? And I was lost because I think in meters, not in feet, and then to convert that, and then I don't think in those numbers. And he was definitely frustrated with me until I called my husband, who is an engineer, and they had a lovely conversation. And my husband said the exact length from this point to that point in this particular RV lot is 38.2. And then if you go to another park, you might need an extension. And I would recommend you go to Walmart and you get this and this. And the guy said, you are the seventh park, and you're the only park that listened, and you spoke my language. And he became our most frequent customer because we answered his needs. And so my wonderful stories about the sunsets didn't go well with him because he needed specifics. And that was important to adjust, for me to recognize that he was not trying to irritate me. He was not a bore. He was not a difficult customer. I was not speaking his language. And we adjusted, and that worked very well.
That's a lovely story of cross culture, Irina, running your own business with fellow citizens. Now tell us, what's a typical day like at NASA?
So I'm a professional interpreter. So I am a professional communicator. So I make sure that the message is traveling from one language to another, from one culture to another. And as professional interpreters, we don't interpret words, but the meaning behind it, which is also very important. So usually, because of the time difference with Russia, my day starts quite early, 4 a.m., 5 a.m. And then I go to NASA and we have telephone conference or video conferences when engineers and managers and doctors and nutritionists have a chance to work on whatever projects they work supporting the space station, which is 15 nations working together. And if you think about it, and it's the most successful endeavor that the humankind took today, peaceful human endeavor that humankind took to date, as some of the, I mean, all of the modules that have been docked in space have never met on the ground. So the engineers had to make sure that the differences in our metric system and the US system we have, the differences in our approaches, differences in communication, all come together for this extremely precise work that we're doing, docking vehicles, docking modules, making sure that the health standards are the same, making sure that it's safe for the crew that is in space. So I've been privileged for over 20 years to be able to provide communication. So I was one of the first interpreters who was qualified to support a spacewalk, which is the most dangerous endeavor for us humans outside of the space station. And so I usually interpret in the morning, and then I support meetings or the crew training where you have international teams of crew members and they learn each other's systems and protocols and responses. Sometimes it's a fire response, so we have a chance to run inside the modules and I have a chance to follow the crew, which is very exciting. And a lot of cases, it's space to ground communication. So as I'm in headsets and it's docking or landing. And I have been to Kazakhstan 29 times with NASA. So I was very fortunate, and I was the first interpreter to go to landings with the search and rescue team and meet the capsule from space. And as the medical tent would be deployed to be there with the different teams of doctors from all over the world. And then as different composition of crews would fly, sometimes we have Belgian princes who would join us at the landing, or you have Japanese journalists who are there. So it's a really exciting, vibrant international community supporting the space station program. And I have a chance to work with the best of the best engineers, crew members, doctors, managers. It's really exciting.
Yes, it must be. Are there any amusing things that you're able to recount about your cross-cultural encounters between people who are in outer space?
Almost daily. And sometimes the stories I share with my husband are so interesting, but they all boil down to differences, cultural differences. And that's what makes it so interesting. I mean, even the language, sometimes it's driven by our culture. So if you have, let's say, Russian cosmonauts who are training for a spacewalk and they're in the pool, which is called NBL, Neutral Buoyancy Lab in Houston. So they go down, it's very heavy, strenuous work. I remember one time I was called by my company to rush to the NBL facility as they had a major misunderstanding. So once I arrived, I asked the cosmonaut, I said, what's going on? And he said, well, I'm just resting. So I asked the instructor what's going on. And she was in tears saying he is not cooperating. He's refusing to follow the instructions. And I said, what did you say? And she said, well, I said, if you would like to go to the right and pick up this ratchet wrench, then do this. And he said, well, what do you mean? I'm a military. So what does she mean if I would like? If I don't need to, I'll just rest and wait for the instructions. So I had to teach them and say the English is not the native language for the crew members, and they literally understand when you say, well, if you don't mind, or if you'd like to do this, go to the right and please pick up. And I said, no, just say go to the right, pick it up and do it, so they understand these are the instructions. So you have to adjust. And I've been training, being on the interface between the cultures. I've been training the international teams in space and on the ground of how to work together and how to make sure your message gets across, whether it's through language or through culture.
What a great illustration. And it's important to remember that it's all very well understanding yourself, understanding other cultures, but then you need to do something and adapt. And I'm sure you've had the experience of that as well, where it's very difficult to get someone to adapt. We've got an expression in English, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink.
That's very true. And I remember when I was on my first tour in Russia with NASA, my boss, who was a brilliant astronaut, he would say, Irina, why are you drinking tea with the Russians, wasting your time, as they would stop by our office? He said, you have so many emails to answer. So I had to explain the values for a Russian business culture, to build personal relationship first, and then they might decide whether they want to do business with you or not. So you cannot just be very linear as we are in the US business culture and just go and request this or that without first establishing relationships, learning the names properly, learning the spouses' anniversaries, maybe spending some time together, maybe going to the dacha place or going to a charity event together, and just learning about each other. And I would say, well, show your family photos, tell about your favorite pet you have, and so you let in your partners who you are and why it's important to do business with you. And I have seen cases in Russia where Russian businessmen would refuse to do business with you if for some reason they don't like you, to the financial detriment for them. But they would say, no, I don't want to do business with this person. He or she is not trustworthy. So it's very important to know what are the values in that particular culture or for that particular person.
This has been a fascinating conversation, Irina. What experiences you've had in these 30 years in the US? When we discuss cross culture, I always think we need to start by considering not just the differences, but the similarities. As we draw to a close, in your opinion, what do the Americans and the Russians have in common?
I think similarities between Russians and Americans, especially if you're in Texas, because The US culture is also so diverse. You look at East and West and South and North. But if you look at Texas, Texans are very proud of their state. They kind of shoot from the hip. They're very direct, very family oriented. So that I think resonates very well with the Russians, who are proud people, who are proud of the achievements, who are into caring for the young, for the families, for the elders, and not afraid to take risks. So I think Texans and Russians are not afraid to take risks and will just be the pioneers, and whether in space, on the ground, or new business technologies. So that really unites, I think, the Russians and Americans. And I think that's one of the reasons the cooperation with the Russians have been so successful, as they can understand each other, understand each other's values so well, and not get into much politics when it comes to the groundwork of technical work. There's not much politics, but trying to bring the best, bring the safest for the crew members on the International Space Station, and just advance as a humankind. So I think both cultures feel very comfortable working together because they can tell it as it is. They like to have barbecues in Texas, or go to the saunas in dacha places in Russia, or go skiing together. So sharing these experiences that enrich them is very important.
Yeah, and finally, what would two or three key differences be between the Russians and the Americans?
Russians are very direct, and you will know immediately whether you're liked by them or you're disliked by them. Um, Trust has to be earned. It's not given to you. And they might look a little rough at the beginning. When you do contract negotiations with the Russians, there is a theatrical element to it. So they might get up or be loud or say some strong words just to dissuade you. Russians are extremely good negotiators. And therefore, I always say, don't pay attention to the appearances. Look into the matter. Be prepared for the meetings, and look into that. In terms of hierarchy, I think it's very similar. So usually, if you have leaders of the similar level, they can make decisions. They're authorized. They have a whole team who is working with them. But I would say, yeah, these are the differences. If
Well, our time is up, Irina. That was fabulous. What a great start, and I hope you'll be back soon. This time in my seat, chairing a cross-cultural encounter with other guests. Have a lovely evening.